Hi, I'm Adrian Halverstadt, Director of Criminal Justice at Berkeley College. Before moving into my current role, I had the privilege of directing online biblical studies and Christian leadership and ministry. One of my greatest joys still to this day is teaching Bible courses. And I'd like to welcome you to this introductory lecture for a 6-week course, Old Testament Models of Leadership. In this course, we examine leadership models found in the Old Testament. Through a close reading of selected texts and research articles and viewing video lectures, we will explore different approaches to leadership, noting the strengths and the limitations of each. By examining the leadership of biblical figures from the Old Testament, we will gain insight into the qualities that make a successful leader and how these qualities can be applied in Christian life, service, and our vocational calling, whatever that may be. One of the greatest needs in society today is quality leadership. When it comes down to setting things right, about seeking justice in the world today, whether it's in our families, our community, our place of work, the church, or the criminal justice system as a whole, it all rises and falls on leadership. If we're going to set things right, if we're going to see things be made right as they should be according to God's original design and purpose, we must be willing to lead in effective ways. It will rise and fall on our leadership. God has called you and me to be a leader. Doesn't matter who we are, what our vocation is, where we're from, how much education we have or not, whether we have a lot or a little in life, God has called us to leadership. In fact, that precedent is set back in the book of Genesis at the time of creation. After God created everything, He gave man and wife, husband and wife, the mandate to have dominion on the earth. That word dominion comes from the Hebrew word radah, and it means to be a person of influence that brings about the purposes of God. To use your influence to bring about the purposes of God. So God intended for men and women to do this very thing. And as a Christian, we're called to influence society, and that means we must lead. The Old Testament is a primer for leadership principles and examples, and it can help us as influencers. As it is now, so it was in Old Testament times. There are no perfect leaders. All the people that we will study from the Old Testament had human limitations. They had flaws. Man, they messed up. They had big problems at times. But there is one thing that they seem to have in common. They believed that they were called and equipped by God to get the job done, to overcome the injustice, to right the wrong of their time, to set things right. They were just ordinary people who got the job done, often and most of the time in the face of insurmountable odds. They had limited resources. They were in difficult circumstances, and they did it all for the good of people and for the glory of God. God has called us to do the same. And we will discover together from the Old Testament the traits, the qualities, and the behaviors of a good leader. Let me share an introduction to Old Testament leadership to kind of set the palette for us throughout this study. The Old Testament is a rich source of wisdom and insight into leadership that continues to inspire people and guide them in their leadership today. In fact, the Bible as a whole contains many examples of leadership. Although the Bible does not explicitly describe leadership models or theories in the way that we read about in modern literature today, it does disclose some leadership principles and examples that can be found in the Bible. What are some of these principles and examples? Well, there's servant leadership. Jesus is often cited as an example of servant leadership, as he led by serving others and putting their need before his own. He also led by example. The Bible frequently highlights the importance of leaders setting a positive example for others to follow. Transformational leadership. is seen in the Bible. Leaders such as Moses and David are credited with inspiring and motivating their followers to achieve great things. There's visionary leadership seen in the Bible. Prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah provided visions of the future, a preferred future for their people that would inspire them to work towards a better world and to take action. Charismatic leadership is also seen in the Bible. Characters such as Samson and Deborah are said to have possessed charismatic qualities that drew people to them and inspired loyalty. In the remaining time we have set aside for this lecture, I'd like for us to focus on two specific aspects of leadership that we see in the Old Testament. One, the concept of leadership in the Old Testament, and two, the role or influence that individual context has on a person's leadership. The concept of leadership, unique to the Old Testament. It's important to note that leadership in the Old Testament was not just a secular pursuit. It was closely tied to the religious faith of the Israelites. They saw God as the ultimate leader and guide. God was seen as the one who appointed leaders and gave them the authority and the power to lead his people. As such, leaders were expected to be accountable not only to people, the ones they led, but also to God. One of the most famous leaders in the Old Testament is Moses. We'll spend a lot of time looking at his life. He was called by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. Moses exhibited many qualities that are still valued in leaders today. Qualities such as courage, humility, and the ability to communicate effectively. Moses was a servant leader who put the needs of his people before his own, and he was guided by a deep sense of faith in God. David, who was the second king of Israel, was another example of successful leadership in the Old Testament. He was chosen by God to lead Israel after Saul, the first king, proved to be unworthy. Remember my previous statement? Success hinges and falls, rises and falls, I should say, on leadership. Well, Saul is a case in point. His leadership failed because he wasn't a man, an ethical man. He wasn't a man that had the right qualities to lead. So David was chosen in his place. David was known for his courage, charisma, and vision. He united the tribes of Israel and established Jerusalem as the capital. He was a visionary leader who wrote many of the Psalms that we have in the Bible, words that express his deep devotion and love for God. Another successful leader in the Old Testament was King Solomon, David's son. Solomon was known for his wisdom and strategic thinking. He built up Israel's economy, expanded its territories through alliances and trade agreements. He was a great leader. Solomon was also a just ruler who was known for his ability to solve disputes fairly. Remember that famous story from the Bible of the two women who came to him claiming to be the mother of the child, and how Solomon decided that matter? A brilliant man, definitely gifted by God. Deborah, a prophetess and a judge, one of the few women leaders we read about in the Old Testament. Deborah was known for her collaborative leadership style, working with others to bring about change. Deborah was a gifted communicator who inspired the Israelites to fight against their oppressors, and she was able to build consensus among the numerous Israelite tribes at that time. One of the key lessons we learn from Old Testament examples of leadership is that successful leadership is not just about power and authority. It's also about service, humility, and accountability to God. The Old Testament leaders were guided by their faith in God, and they saw their leadership roles as a way of fulfilling God's will. They were also able to inspire and unite people, communicate effectively, and make difficult decisions when necessary. Leadership in the Old Testament was complex and multifaceted. It was deeply tied to religious faith and hope and trust in God. had courage associated with it, perseverance, many of the traits that we'll study and need to implement more and more in our own leadership. Examples of Moses, David, Solomon, and Deborah show us that successful leadership requires a combination of qualities such as courage, vision, strategic thinking, collaboration, communication, and a deep sense of faith and accountability to others and to God. These lessons will inspire us and guide us in our leadership today. Let's examine the role or influence of context and the leadership styles that we see in the Old Testament. The Old Testament provides a rich historical and cultural background that informs our understanding of the biblical leaders. These leaders emerged in a time of great upheaval and change. Their leadership styles were shaped by social and cultural norms of their time in many ways. The Israelites were a nomadic people who lived in the Middle East during the Iron Age. They were a tribal society with a strong religious faith that centered on the worship of the one true God, Yahweh as they referred to him. He was their God. They were also a people who were frequently at war with their neighbors, and their leaders had to be able to navigate complex political and military challenges. We learn from the Old Testament that a leader's style is shaped by a variety of factors. It is important to understand how these factors intersect and contributed to the ways that they led. The first factor for our consideration is the social context. A leader's social context refers to the people and groups that they interact with on a regular basis. These interactions can shape a leader's style in numerous ways. For example, if a leader is part of a hierarchical organization with strict rules and procedures, they may adopt a more authoritarian leadership style. On the other hand, if a leader is part of a more collaborative or egalitarian group, they may adopt a more participatory leadership style. The second factor is cultural context. A leader's cultural context refers to the shared values and beliefs and customs of the society in which they were raised. Cultural influences oftentimes shape a leader's values and worldview, which in turn can affect their leadership style. For example, a leader from a Quaker culture, a collectivist culture as it's sometimes referred to, may place a greater emphasis on teamwork or group consensus, whereas a leader from an individualistic or nonconformist culture may prioritize individual achievement and personal initiative in their leadership style. A third factor that contributes to leadership style seen in the Old Testament and also speaks into our leadership style today is historical context. A leader's historical context refers to the major events and trends that have shaped their generation and the society in which they live. These historical influences can shape a leader's beliefs and values, which in turn can affect their leadership style. For example, a leader who grew up in a time of political turmoil may have more caution and be more conservative in their leadership style, while a leader who came of age during a time of social change and activism may be more willing to take risks and challenge the status quo of their day. These three factors, a leader's social, cultural, and historical context, can have a profound impact on their leadership style. We will take that into account as we look at these Old Testament personalities, and we also take note of them in terms of how they influence our leadership today. Understanding these factors will help us better understand the decisions and actions of leaders. It can also help us develop more effective leadership strategies in a variety of contexts. Certainly, the leadership styles of Old Testament personalities were shaped by the social and cultural norms of their time. Patriarchal leadership was a norm in ancient Israel, and many of the biblical leaders were men who established their authority through their wealth and status as fathers and husbands. However, there were exceptions, such as Deborah, who demonstrated that women could also be effective leaders. Faith is also an important factor in the leadership styles of the Old Testament personalities we'll look at. Many of them saw their leadership role as a way of fulfilling God's will, as they relied on their faith in God's providence and power for the results. Over the next 5 weeks, we will discover through the examples of Old Testament leaders that effective leadership requires a combination of qualities such as charisma, humility, strategic thinking, collaboration, communication, and a deep sense of faith and accountability to God as our authority. I'm glad to be on this journey with you. Please join me as we walk this out together and to become the people that God wants us to be and our world needs us to be.